Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Bible Study for the United Church of Newport, October 13th, 2021. My name is James Merriam. I am one of the ministers here at the United Church of Newport, and wherever you are and whoever you are, wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here, and we are glad to have you joining us for this little time of devotion, this little time of reflection, this time when we can dive into the very unusual passages in Scripture that we otherwise really wouldn't get a chance to in any kind of a real way. We're going to be looking at the prophets this coming Sunday, a little passage from Isaiah that's very famous and very misunderstood. And so we have the chance, because that's going to dominate this Sunday service, to look at the other Old Testament scripture that's presented in this week's lectionary, which is also one that's strange and unusual, and much can be made of, and the sort of significance of is maybe less for our direct understanding or direct application, but it's helpful in understanding much of the rest of Scripture. We are reading from the book of Job, which, of course, in our Christian Bible is normally put sort of in the middle of the Old Testament. The reasons for that are complicated and kind of lost to time, and it doesn't make a huge amount of sense. They are sort of clumped with what's broadly called the writings or the other. It doesn't fit any good categories, so some sort of other in the Christian scripture. And in the Bible I'm using, the Hebrew Bible that I'm using, which is arranged in the traditional Jewish way, it's in book 3, which is the medium size of the 3, and it's the writings. So this would be included quite near the end of what would be called the Hebrew Bible. You'll see I'm also most of the way, that's what we have left, most of the way through, so there are only a few more books that follow, including, of course, actually this is a very different orientation, because the books of Chronicles, which are really just a repetition and a rehash with sort of a more of a politically correct spin on them, to the book of Kings, is included at the very end of the writings, as it's sort of the tradition of putting things that are less important at the end. Sometimes the end can be a place of honor, sometimes it can be just sort of a place to stick other things, or to put other things that are sort of a different type of category. Of course, the book of Job is an instance where it's not, it forms a full narrative, it forms a full sort of spiritual journey. It's a very, very old story. A story really so old it's been difficult to place it correctly, or to sort of reconcile with what is clearly a story about God, and clearly a story about God's relationship with human beings, maybe in a more direct way than a lot of other passages and a lot of other books in Scripture. It's very direct about that. It's set an example for how we see quite a few different things in Scripture broadly. Of course, the featuring and the interpretation of Satan potentially as being the sort of wicked angel who dares God to do this whole experiment with his faithful servant Job. That has a lot of influence. It's sort of inspired the fallen angel idea. There's really it's weird. It's weird, and it's different. And it's very, very old. In terms of when it was written, that's maybe less of a debate, but when this story got sort of settled in and this story got sort of codified is of great debate. That it would be included in sacred scripture was never really a doubt. It's just sort of where and then what to make of it. Such that really it's been kind of, the details and the particular bits of it have been kind of ignored. It's very much a children's, it's become very much a children's Bible story, along especially with Noah's Ark, these sort of super sanitized versions of these stories, because, I mean, it's God testing you sort of plays well in a very simple sort of a circumstance, and especially because it has a happy ending. And we're going to be reading from chapter 38, which is sort of the first, or is not even the first, it's sort of partway through this long sort of poetic proclamation by God, which is answered by a short proclamation by Job. And then in the final chapter, chapter 41, a few pages later, you have chapter 42, at the few pages later, you see how there's the very brief answering from Job that's in Poetics, and then this little bit and this little bit that's just descriptive. That's Job being sort of reconciled. That's Job being blessed even more greatly than he was in earlier times, in later times. Of course, he has a whole new family, and then he has new descendants after that, which doesn't really sit well with contemporary audiences, and I imagine hasn't really sat that well with audiences at any stage along the way, because he lost his wife and his whole family like that. And to reclaim wealth is one thing, but to rebuild families is a much more complicated and difficult thing. But that's not what we're talking about. We're in the midst of God's answering to Job in the whirlwind, because Job is in a very low and dirty and despicable place. He has been lost by almost all of those he's been cast aside by all those who loved him, those for whom he was just a sort of a means to an end. But God in the whirlwind is speaking to Job. And the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, and he said, "Who is this who darkens counsel in words without knowledge? Gird your loins like a man, that I may ask you, and you can inform me. Where were you when I founded the earth? Tell if you know understanding. Who fixed its measure, do you know, or who stretched a line upon it? In what were the sockets sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Who hedged the sea with double doors, when it gushed forth from the womb, when I made clouds its clothing, and thick mist its swaddling bands? I made breakers upon it my limit, and set a bolt with double doors, and I said, thus far come no further. Here halt the surge of your waves. Have you ever commanded the morning, appointed the dawn to its place, to seize the earth's corners, that the wicked be shaken from it? It turns like sealing clay, takes color like a garment, and their light is withdrawn from the wicked, and the upraised arm is broken. Have you come into the springs of the sea, in the bottommost deep walked about? Have the gates of death been laid bare to you, and the gates of death's shadow have you seen? Did you take in the breadth of the earth? Tell if you know it all. Where is the way that light dwells, and darkness, where is its place, that you might take it to its home, and understand the paths to its house? You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great. Have you come into the storehouse of snow, the storehouse of hail have you seen, which I keep for a time of strife, for a day of battle and war? By what way does the west wind fan out, the east wind whip over the earth? Who split a channel for the torrent and a way for the thunderstorm, to rain on a land without man, wilderness bare of humankind, to sate the desolate dunes, to make the grass sprout there? Does the rain have a father, or who begot the drops of dew? From whose belly did the ice come forth, to the frost of the heavens who gave birth? Water congeals like stone, and the face of the deep locks hard. Can you tie the bands of the Pleiades, or loose Orion's reins? Can you bring constellations out in their season, lead the great bear and her cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you fix the rule on earth? Can you lift your voice to the cloud, that the water spate covers you? Can you send lightning bolts on their way, and they will say to you, here we are? Who placed in the hidden parts wisdom, or who gave the mind understanding? Who counted the skies in wisdom, and the jars of the heavens who tilted, when the dust melts to a mass, and the clods cling fast together? Can you hunt prey for the lion, for the kings of beasts' appetites? When it crouches in its den, lies in ambush in the covert, who readies the raven's prey, when its young cries out to God, and strays deprived of food? Now let's see. Anyway, just wanted to check something quickly. So yeah, this is also a rare instance in Bible study or in Scripture generally, where all of that is God talking. The famous red letter Bible that highlights when Jesus is speaking really demonstrates just how little of Scripture is actually Jesus speaking. And for quite a lot of Scripture, even what's attributed to God is a pretty small portion. There's a lot, of course, in the Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, because that's written as by the priestly source, trying to give credence and credibility to all of these rituals and traditions. So they're written as being God instilled. God said, "Do this, do this, do this." But God flowing on in this way in poetry is something very interesting and very different. And again, it's so dramatic, and it's really quite beautiful, even translated into English in the way that's more literal, as this is, as Robert Alter's translation tries to achieve. What I've got. Even in something that flows on like this, it's got hello. Oh, it's nice to see you. Even in something that flows on like this, in this way, it's really remarkable. Of course, I felt myself wanting to flow and sing and be like swept up in the words, but to remember, and it comes in a little bit of a better, it comes better expressed at a couple of instances. This is sarcastic, the whole thing, deeply sarcastic. Dripping with scorn and ridicule, and the final last, or the sort of grand culmination of all the drama in the course of Job, where Job loses everything he has, where Job sort of loses his direction in life, where Job loses his friends, where Job has these great revelations, and sort of now has abandoned and given up and said he's endured everything possible, and God has more than a few words for Job to say that he's taken all that he could possibly take, and he's done now. So these are repudiation of despair, in short, basically, with deep sarcasm. Notably, in verse 21, it says, "You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great." Dripping disdain for Job, having earlier said that he'd seen it all. He'd seen all that he could possibly see. He'd suffered all that he could possibly suffer. There are, of course, a whole bunch of things that are very familiar. In the beginning, it says, "Gird your loins like a man, that I might ask you, and you can inform me." So it's you've taken all of this, but can you even handle? Are you even strong enough? Are you even man enough to handle these simple words, these simple questions I'm going to ask you? Of course, they're all rhetorical questions. There's no interest in actually answering. Job is given no opportunity to respond, and it's not like he would respond even if he had, because what can you say in response to the stories of the creation of the world? We also have maybe some clues about the role that this story particularly played, because near the beginning also, and actually it's what would normally be read in the lectionary would just be the very beginning and the very end of this. So verses 1 through 7. Verse 7 is, "When the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy." And all the sons of God shouted for joy. Now that's, of course, got a complicated thing and gotten wrapped up with the tradition of the Nephilim, the sort of demigods or half angels, or those who had fallen to earth. The sons of man or the sons of God and the daughters of men had children who were sort of like giants. Now that those characters feature very prominently and very dramatically in the fairly recent movie version of Noah, which is actually very faithful to sort of the Old Testament tradition, though it's also very faithful to contemporary action movie traditions, and sort of is an interesting mix of things. Those very unfamiliar in terms of what Sunday school Noah's Ark tends to be like. This also is very unfamiliar in terms of what Sunday school Job is generally like. Hello, hello. Can you say hello to everyone? We're not quite waving. We're almost waving. Hello. Oh, there's a wave. There's a wave. Okay. Sunday school Job, because this level of sarcasm and some interesting illustrations. So just after verse 7, we have, who hedged the sea with double doors when it gushed forth from the womb? I think this is not included in the lectionary, potentially not so much because of the maybe unsavory illustration here, but because hedging the sea with double doors is perhaps a direct reference to the Canaanite story of creation, which we hear some echoes of through scriptures, God being a spirit over the water in the beginning of Genesis. A parallel there, and sort of a consistent use of the power of God to dominate over the forces that were said by the Canaanites to have created the world. So this is putting our God into your story and saying that it was our God actually directing your story. So you are more foolish for having recognized the events, knowing the right events, but being unable to see with clarity the causes. So it's about power, certainly, and whether Job came as a Canaanite story that was already in existence when the new tradition came into the land, we don't really know, or if it came from somewhere else. But in any case, it's using this as an opportunity to proclaim God's greatness, not just in the context of Job, but in the sort of geopolitical context or the tradition that was going at the time. We also have who fixed the measures of the earth, or who stretched a line upon it. This is, of course, the first use in terms of writing of God, the architect, God setting the plumb line for the world. That will be echoed later, used by the prophets. In what were its sockets sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? That's sockets for either corner posts of wood construction, or of there were a long tradition of using sort of brass or bronze clips, basically, to lock together important stones in construction. Because to a certain extent, mortar and the weight of stone will keep a building together, but there are special and particular points that need to be locked together with these particular things. And that goes back to ancient Egypt. That's the sockets for the locks, or the sockets, the spots for the corner posts in wooden construction. And where they are and how they're done is the great skilled is one of the great skilled components of construction, and so would have been a skilled component in the construction of the world, or so this poem includes. Then we have, after that, we have God making the clouds the clothing for the emerging world that has been born out of the sea, and thick mist its swaddling bands. This is actually was highlighted as being a completely new, really lovely sort of metaphor, and unique metaphor, entirely original to Job, that perhaps contributed somewhat to the poetic use and delight in swaddling clothes. Somebody's getting into everything, of swaddling clothes that goes all the way through to Jesus. That some of his some of the prophecies that hello, Lovey Bear, hello. Some of the prophecies that Jesus fulfills and that are repeatedly used, and then of course are so much used in our Christmas story, is talking about the swaddling clothes, the very first clothing of any kind that a human being will wear, the wrap up from the very beginning, and that is really echoes and brings forward not only God as the creator and the focus on God the creator in this story, but also the idea of Job experiencing a rebirth through this ordeal and this experience. Quite a lot is read into that in certain contexts where being born again or being reborn is a really big deal. You can see that. You can certainly see that whether it's the central message that should be taken out of the story of Job generally, or out of Scripture particularly, since being dying and being reborn in the water of baptism is a metaphor that Paul chooses to try to illustrate the importance of baptism and how it's more than just the ritual washing, which it didn't really seem any different from to the earliest Christian audiences. Further on, we have actually another repeat from our scripture reading, or our Bible study reading last week from the prophet Amos. But in this instance, this is probably that Amos is emulating Job, or potentially, though it's not like you're not allowed to come up with the same metaphor independently. But Amos not only references the plumb line and God putting a plumb line amongst his people, not just for its creation, but for its guidance in life. But then we have the passage that was the incongruent, the added piece of scripture passage that didn't fit with the rest of Amos's writings, talked about specifically calling out Orion and the Pleiades, which of course are the contemporary names, but for constellations in the sky that would have been known then, and are notable for being two of the constellations that are easiest to identify. The Orion the Hunter, the 3 stars in a row, that's so easy to pick out in the night sky, and the Pleiades, sometimes called the 7 Sisters, which there are actually like 13 stars, but you can't tell that without a telescope, and is actually the symbol and the namesake of the Japanese car company Subaru, because Subaru is the Japanese name for that same constellation. There's also calling out the Great Bear, Ursa Minor, or Ursa Major, which is easily found in the sky. So it's the calling out the most obvious and most universally recognized constellations in a way that almost the poetry just rolls on, and it flows in Job, but it's added in Amos without really thought of context or what's going on, and was just dropped in seemingly because it sounded good, or it seemed like the kind of thing that might fit in that instance. So there's also talking about God walking in the depths of the ocean, which the places below and the places above. The comparison between the deep ocean and outer space actually continue to this very day. But the idea in ancient times that there was water above the earth and water below the earth, and both of them were equally inaccessible and purely the domain of God, is kind of understandable for those for whom more than a few feet underwater, especially the ancient Hebrews, were not really a boat building or a seafaring people at all. So the deep, dark water would be a terrible place, far out of access. Now this continues for several more chapters, heading towards that chapter 42 conclusion, where all is made right for Job. But it's a poem about the greatness of God. It's an extremely extended, as would sort of be the tradition at the time, of something that you could sing to yourself or sing to others around the campfire, or sing while you were walking over long distances, or riding over long distances, or sing to yourself while you're herding sheep. It's the idea of having long, past the time, devotional sort of devices, and it's a very effective one. It's a really neat one. It's a really cool one to put it more into an English poetry while being faithful to the tradition, rather than thinking of it as necessarily instructive. It can be really neat, really helpful, and I would encourage you to keep reading through chapter 39, chapter 40, even chapter 41. So Job is weird, but that doesn't mean, and it's hard to pick out what exactly it is, but that doesn't mean we can't get a lot out of it. Anyway, Sunday morning worship, 10 o'clock. We'll see you all there, and God bless.